ELI5. Is time a real, tangible thing, or just a concept invented by humans that doesn't actually exist? Also, if time does exist, doesn't there have to be a definable beginning or end? Otherwise, it's just infinity, which to me suggests the absence of time. I partially read The Discoverers by Daniel Boorstin several years ago, and he discussed how different societies conceptualized of time and how they kept time, and it has had me wondering ever since. Then I started exploring Zen Buddhism, which emphasizes the present moment as the only tangible reality, along with the illusion of the ego, which only furthered my questioning. Edit. I am aware that the concept of time is based on the revolution of the Earth and its moon. However, that is just how humans conceive of time. That's not proof of time itself. The answer. So you're sort of halfway to understanding time as a concept, because you've started to question the idea that the things that we usually use to mark the passage of time, seconds and minutes and hours, and even things like planetary rotations and lunar orbits, are largely arbitrary, and would change depending on where you're based relative to other things. A slightly trickier question, though, is how do we know that 1 second is the same length as every other second? Maybe if there was an outside perspective of time, 1 minute could last this long, and another minute could last thiiiiiiiiiis long, but they feel the same length to us because one of them was squished together with us inside of it. Each one of them contains a minute's worth of stuff. But just because they feel the same length to us, how do we know they actually are from some external and objective reality? Weirdly, this isn't as crazy as it sounds. Time is an effect of relativity, in which, from an ELI5 perspective, a second as perceived by one person might be a very different length to a second as perceived by a different person, depending on how fast they're going. You can define a second as the time it takes a pendulum of a certain length to swing once, and that time will be the same for both person A and person B. But person A's pendulum might swing dozens or hundreds of times more often than person B's pendulum from person A's perspective during the same interval, depending on their relative speeds. Relativity is complicated, and things get very unintuitive very quickly. We can calculate these values consistently and show them to be real. In fact, things like GPS satellites depend on us being able to calculate these values consistently. But they're still different from the point of view of each observer. So how can we define time at all if it's not the same everywhere? If time depends on how fast you're moving, how do we know that it actually even exists at all? One way is to think about time not in terms of measuring it, but in terms of whether we can detect time happening in the first place. Now we're not interested in whether a second is a second, but whether a second is anything meaningful at all. In that sense, what we call time is really just a measurement of change. After all, the only way to detect the passage of time is to note how things vary from one point to the next. You can think of it like taking two photos. If you can't detect any changes between the photos, how do you know that it's two photos taken seconds or minutes or weeks or years apart, rather than just two copies of the same photo? One of these is the principle of cause and effect, namely that if an action A causes an effect B, A must have happened before, or rather, at an earlier time than B. One way to think of time, then, is as a measurement of causal effect. Time must be progressing because change keeps happening, and because change happens in one direction only. The value we assign to time, perhaps thought of as the countdown that has progressed from the start of everything to what we call now, has to keep increasing. The classic example is unscrambling an egg. From our perspective, the unscrambled egg must always come before the scrambled egg, and so it can be seen that time can only act in one direction. As a result, A must predate B. Follow this channel for more Santa Explains.